It is Friday, October 10th. Let's talk PlayStation. Welcome back, everyone, to another Battlefield episode of LTPS. We've got a lot going on again this week, so let's begin, as always, with our PS Plus reminder, which the October games are now live for the Essential lineup. We also saw that the Alan Wake 2 expansion or Digital Deluxe Edition DLC is only $6. That's on sale, so that includes the Lake House and Night Springs DLC. That's only on sale until October 23rd, though, so just a little PSA there. And we can segue nicely into our first news story, which is a rumor about PlayStation Plus Extra. This one was reported by Biblicune writing for Deal Labs, where a very big headline title, Silent Hill 2, is allegedly going to be in the lineup, which that should be announced next week on October 15th, which Biblicune has been incredibly reliable. They tend to get information directly firsthand in terms of regional marketing sources, so typically that's why they're always like right on the money. So anytime you see a report from Biblicune, there's some high degree of confidence in that will probably be true. So an excellent month for not just Essential, but also Extra as well, for two high caliber, very on-theme games going into the service. So hopefully that will indeed be true. We actually have, as a sidebar here, some rumors from Dusk Golem about Silent Hill 2 that we're possibly going to get that multi-platform announcement for Xbox Series and Switch 2, and also new DLC for the game, which is up for contention because that would be quite odd for a game that is a remake, so that would be entirely new content. And then also the much-needed PS5 Pro patch is allegedly on the way as well. We'll follow that closely and see what ends up happening. Moving on to our next news story, Sony has finally launched written reviews for the PlayStation Store, which, if you remember, over a year ago now at this point, Sony was testing this in a very controlled way by sending out email invitations inviting people to write reviews for games on the PS Store, and it was only for really high-profile games like Helldivers 2, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and I think they were testing this on a regional basis even during the PS4 days for certain places, but now it is finally available for everybody. Only on desktop, not on console. You can't write reviews on console, you can't see the reviews on console, but for now, on desktop, on the PlayStation Store, if you digitally own a game, and that's the only way to verify it for now, but you can write a 4,000 character review, you can put a title on there, you can also denote if your review has spoilers in it or not, and it also shows what version of the game you own, which would be base, digital deluxe edition, things like that, but you can write a review for the game that you have bought. Now, weirdly enough, it doesn't verify if you launch the game, so people already found out that you can buy a game, immediately write a review for that game, so it's clearly early days, not nearly as robust as something like Steam, where it attaches gameplay hours to a review, and ideally it should be a hard requirement that you put some amount of time into a game before being able to write a review, or at least have a small window of when you buy and then being able to write the review. So early days, but good to see this finally. So the PS Store is very bare bones and basic, almost to it's a detriment to the store, because ideally I'd love to see it be a little bit more fleshed out, similar to Steam in this regard. So you would think over time that's where they're going to be, but they can be very slow with these things, considering the beta stuff was over a year ago now at this point, and we're finally getting it only on desktop. But hey, it's finally here, and hopefully in another year's time it will be even better. Next up, we have more merch-related announcements, which first and foremost, the PlayStation Gear Store, the official site where you can buy things from Sony, that is shutting down December 31st. That was posted as a PSA on every version of the site, so US, UK, and the EU, and all sales final. They're running sales right now, but it will be shutting down. Which you might look at that and think, why are they doing this? Is it not lucrative enough? But that might tie into our next story, which we should first mention. It was the announcement of a new DualSense controller on the PS blog, the Icon Blue Special Edition. This thing is very, very blue. Sony says it's inspired by PlayStation's heritage, with layered shades of blue and a glossy pattern of PlayStation shapes on the touchpad. It's coming out October 20th for the US and Canada, and then October 28th for Mexico and Chile, priced at $84.99 USD. It will be available exclusively at Walmart locations and online. I'm fairly certain that's the collaboration here, because in the same blog post we can mention that Sony announced some new merchandise available at Walmart, certain select stores, so not all locations, but select stores and also online as well. So the merch they announced here is an Astrobot lunchbox, Twisted Metal Melts figures, a PlayStation jersey, and a monogram backpack clips, or a bunch of clips rather, and then the Last of Us Ellie mini backpack, again available at Walmart. So it does seem like more of a direct collaboration, and maybe that's the play here, is that Sony is just not really interested in fulfilling their own merchandise nowadays, at least in the US and maybe parts of South America. So it's hard to say. Sony's always really slow with these kind of changes over time, because you would think, why would they not do more locations? Why would they not do more retailers? But that's just kind of how Sony operates, and they can still be somewhat regional in the sense that, like in Japan, for example, they do way more merchandise than we get over here. So the options are seemingly going to be more limited as Sony maybe deprioritizes fulfilling their own merchandise. So maybe that's what they're doing. As far as the controller goes, you know what? I do like it. I'm a sucker for blue things. So I saw this and I thought, oh my God, you guys, can you just stop for 2 seconds? You have enough of my money. But I'm still, I think I can hold off, because like that's my thing. I'm not really going crazy with these limited edition controllers. If I daily an Edge, that's my thought process. If I'm dailying a very expensive pro style controller, now 2 of them, there's no reason to buy these standard controllers unless I'm just putting them up for shelf displays, which that's nice, but they take up space, and there's just really no need for that, at least in my view. So I don't know. They're not going to get me quite yet with this one, but if they do the eventual typical frosted blue see-through controller that they've done with nearly every single PlayStation home console, they might get me for that, because I love those ones, but they still haven't done it just yet for PS5. A very blue, sort of Days of Play inspired looking one, but not the frosted blue one just yet. In other giving Sony money news, it seems not enough people are doing that for the PlayStation The Concert tour dates for the remainder of this year, because all of those shows, nearly all of them, have been shut down and canceled. There is still the New Jersey one that's going on, but the stadium is still very full, or rather very empty. There's a lot of seat availability, so it seems like there's just low ticket sales, and that's why they canceled nearly all of them. The 2026 ones are still available, but I'd be shocked if those things can still land, because there's just a lot of issues going on here. The tickets, from what I've seen, they're very expensive. Also, the economy for tourism and concerts, performers, that has seen a pretty big downturn, so you've got even big name performers struggling to fill out stadiums. So combine that with the more niche aspect of PlayStation music from God of War, The Last of Us, Tsushima. Like, don't get me wrong, I think the performance itself would probably be fantastic. I've heard from the US, or rather the EU shows, that it is a very enjoyable show. It's a good presentation, but combine that with all the other issues and you're kind of set up for failure here. And really, the music is not, it pains me to say it, but maybe not nearly as iconic. Like, the music is incredibly important to the in-the-moment experience. It's very grand, and there's a big orchestra performing in these games, and so like it's incredibly meaningful in the experience. But I don't know. I guess it's just not quite up to the degree. There's not much of a novelty there compared to maybe the music for Final Fantasy, which has a much bigger range to it as far as like how it feels and the set pieces that it's used in moments for the games. And between that or even the Death Stranding 2 and DS1 soundtrack, right? Like those songs just they hit in a very different way, and they stand out a lot more versus maybe just a handful of the main themes from these other big epic PS Studio games, right? So I'm sure it is a very enjoyable presentation, but I think you've got way too many things that are stacked against the show to where it becomes a viable business. So I would be surprised if the 2026 ones do stand, but we'll keep following this and see what happens. Next up, we have some big news here for Next Gen, which this is not a rumor, but an official video from PlayStation on their YouTube channel. It was an 8-minute conversation between the PS5 architect Mark Cerny and also AMD's Jack Huhn, the SVP and GM of Computing and Graphics Group, and they were talking about, yet again, the Amethyst collaboration, which this is retreading some familiar language from the PS5 Pro seminar. So Jack was saying immediately, you can't brute force advancement with raw power alone. Machine learning is the path here. So for example, FSR and PSSR are computationally very expensive on the GPU, which is made up of compute units, so subdividing problems on these are inefficient. So a solution here is something new that AMD is calling neural arrays, which connects the CUs with each shader engine, enabling bigger ML models with less overhead. Now, getting into the ray tracing and path tracing side, this is also taxing on the GPU and shaders. It's plateaued is what they're explaining here, so Jack reveals they're building what's called Radiance cores, and this is going to be a new dedicated hardware block to handle ray tracing and path tracing in real time. The final reveal, however, is universal compression. This is a system that's going to look at everything going into memory and compressing it when possible, and only the essential pieces are sent out. So this will dramatically lower memory bandwidth usage, and this will allow a new level of efficiency and asset streaming, which also enables more in-frame time budget. All of this is to conclude, Mark Cerny saying, and I quote here, "The results are really quite promising, and I'm really excited about bringing them to a future console in a few years' time." Mind you, this is also about bringing these breakthroughs to all platforms, because that is another angle of the AMD and PlayStation collaboration, is that it's about, a rising tide lifts all boats scenario for the entire industry. But PlayStation still has a lot of benefit here in that they are building a new console, and you have Mark outright saying and basically admitting that here are some 3 big breakthrough announcements that will be a key principle of PlayStation 6. And here's the thing that you really have to take away from this if you're not much of a technical person. It's really efficiency is the name of the game here, because all silicon makers are kind of running into that same area of rasterization has plateaued. You can't keep throwing CUs and higher frequencies at GPUs and just expecting them to start spitting out bigger and bigger gains. That's where it's throwing a lot of money into what is a very inefficient system. And so that's part of why ML is such a big deal nowadays, and also having dedicated hardware on the SoC for something like ray tracing and path tracing, because it is very computationally expensive. We've seen a handful of ray tracing usage on PlayStation 5. Not even a handful. I mean, a lot of games do use RT, but sometimes it's either just baked into global illumination. If you do get ray traced reflections, that can be very expensive. And so while you have a few examples of RT reflections within a performance mode, it's very few and far between, right? So these games are there, but that's part of the sort of PS5 growing pains, or rather this generation's primary issue, is that people have been a little bit frustrated with the sort of technical leap from PlayStation 4, which, I'll always say all day, every day, this generation was pretty fantastic right off rip for just having SSDs as a standard. You've got those crazy fast load times where load times are pretty much non-existent, but we also got 60 FPS games for the vast majority of console games. As we get further into the generation, you're seeing some CPU-bound games that are really limiting these titles, and just a handful of UE5 games that aren't totally optimized, and so the 60 FPS modes are very unstable. 4K native is also not really a thing, but it doesn't really need to be a thing, because reconstruction methods have gotten us near 4K image qualities, and that's, again, the name of the game is efficiency, and trying to find a path of enabling a near 4K image quality, which then gives you more frame time, and so you can increase the frame rate, and we can get higher and higher. And so ideally, PlayStation 6, I do think, will visually differentiate itself from PS5 in this world of diminishing returns with efficiency gains like this. ML, path tracing, ray tracing, I think there is a lot of upside here, and it is very opening to see Mark Cerny talk about this in a very transparent way of like, here are 3 main things that we're announcing with AMD, and I would love to put these in a new console. Sony is still very, slow with these things as far as like saying this is PlayStation 6. They'll do it eventually, but this is basically PS6, and we just found out 3 main principles going into that console and how it's being designed. And, to me, that's an exciting prospect, even though for some it feels a little bit too soon. But we did see from Kepler L2 over on NeoGAF discussing this, that they're doubling down on that late 2027 launch and reveal. But even then, if you don't want to put stock in that, it's 7 years, and that's right on target. Moving on to some PlayStation Studios news, which Bungie now technically does qualify as. And so for Marathon, we are hearing a closed technical is happening very soon, October 22nd to the 28th. You can actually sign up right now on Bungie's site, and you can also pick any platform you want. If you want to do PS5 or PC, Xbox, you can sign up. We don't know how many people they're going to let in, but probably going to open up the net a bit more versus the few hundred that have been playing the game so far within the community, and the closed, I guess very early closed alpha that they've been running for a little bit now, but it does seem like they're going to be opening this up a little bit more. And we are hearing from the Game Post, based on a recent data mine they reported on, that the base game was, or at least is, planned to have a launch edition at $40 USD, and the deluxe edition is $60, and the season pass was $10, but that would have been cosmetics only. And the in-game content they were able to discover from the data mine was that the game would launch with 28 weapons total. So, that's out of context in the sense that, like, there's only so much you can learn from a data mine. Oftentimes that will be stuff that, yes, is in the code, but they don't actually launch or plan to ship the game quite like that. And they delayed the game, obviously, so there's a good chance that that data, or at least that news, may or may not be accurate at this point, but it does track with what Sony, as the publisher, was planning on doing for their live service games, which is launching them as a premium price title with a lot of content baked in right away and not monetizing it afterwards as a free-to-play title, which there is still a lot of contention on, if Bungie should launch this game as free-to-play or not, considering what happened to, of course, Concord, but Concord had so many other problems related to it that I don't think Marathon is going to quite run into the same degree of those issues. Every game is unique at the end of the day. I still find that Helldivers 2 is a good example of how you can speak to an audience in a very different way of, like, you're so tired of the free-to-play model where it's very predatory with how they try to monetize it after its launch. We're not going to do that. Here's a premium price game right away, but that immediately does create a bit of a hurdle in asking people to pay for games in this environment where everything is expected to be free to play initially. So it's a weird push and pull. I'm sure Sony and Bungie are still considering their options, but that's at least what we saw from the data mine. Moving on to some Ghost of Yotei news, a lot of players have been really enjoying just how open the game feels, and that is a conscious choice from Sucker Punch, where they were saying for quite a while that this is the most freedom they've ever put into a game. And so recently, speaking with Games Radar, the creative director Jason Cannell spoke about the game's pacing and the open world, saying that if players don't want to do something in that game, then that's okay, that's your choice. As long as you're having fun, we don't care too much about that. And that was their philosophical approach in making Yotei the most open with player freedom than any of their games so far. Now, I don't have context on this because I'm not playing the game right now. I'm working on something else, but that is what I keep hearing about this game, is that it is very open in the sense that you don't necessarily have to go for that gold path right away. The world is, for the most part, open, and you can naturally explore and do things at your own leisure, and that's cool to hear about. That's partly what a lot of the Tsushima experience was getting distracted by a fox den or something, or a mountain that you want to go explore, and typically you were always allowed to go check that out. So it's cool to hear that people have been really enjoying Yotei so far. In fact, the game is naturally doing quite well in Japan. We actually heard from a recent Japanese news report about Yotei selling so well that there's this anticipation from the local government and the economy that they're hoping that will boost Hokkaido with tourism. And there's I believe last week there was also an announcement of a tour you can do with a company that PlayStation was collaborating with. So you're probably going to see a lot of the same things that happened with the Tsushima Island now happen with Hokkaido as well. Next up, something very strange is going on between developer Giant Squid and also Sony, where, if you remember, Giant Squid just recently put out Sword of the Sea on PS5 and also PS Plus Extra, and we had that story recently as well about the game's director, Matt Nava, speaking very positively about that deal for PS Plus, how Sony more or less saved the game. And now what we're seeing, spotted by Gamatsu, is that both Sony and Giant Squid filed a trademark in Europe on October 7th for this game. So both SIE and Giant Squid are listed as the owners, and that has caused some speculation on what's going on. Did Sony acquire the team? Is it simply a publishing deal where Sony was able to fund the game to the point where they did acquire joint ownership of just the IP, not the studio? And it's tough to say. We don't know. What I will add to the, humoring the conversation of did they acquire Giant Squid or would they do something like that? It somewhat tracks for the semblance of how they used to acquire studios, which was long-standing partners. In recent years, it's been more about foundational relationships and established names in the game's business. So like your Tony Hsu, Jade Raymond, Dave Anthony, Jason Blundell, right? So even funding new studios or acquiring them that way. With this, Matt Nava, he was a co-founder of that game, a co-founder of Giant Squid, but he was the art director on 2 games from that game company. It would be Flower and Journey. And so you can see where the established relationship would build upon over the years, and maybe something like that made sense to where we are now, where maybe they acquire Giant Squid. Which that would be actually, I think, great news, just in the sense that it shows PlayStation has a willingness to bring that stuff in-house nowadays, because that's what would be a little bit weird about this acquisition, is that, well, it seems like a relatively small studio compared to all the big names that Sony has nowadays. PlayStation has sort of trimmed off the smaller teams that used to do smaller artsy kind of games like this, right? But I always remind people that they never walked away from those games in the sense that, like, they still do the China Hero program, Indy Hero, Mina Hero. They've expanded those programs. They always align themselves with games like these for PS Plus launches or marketing rights. It's just that, nowadays they don't do this stuff in-house. Now, I think there's value to doing them in-house and aligning the brands closely to PlayStation in a manner where over time they feel like PlayStation IP, and they typically are PlayStation IP, even if 5-10 years down the road they do ship on another platform like Sony is willing to do. But you get my point. There's value to doing these things in-house, so I think this would be great news if they do it, because that implies that they're going back to that ideology. And the other thing too is that with the IP ownership, that was very common. I would say the early PS4 days and under, where even if you don't own the studio, the publishing agreements always were like, the stipulation was, we own the IP. Nowadays, it's a lot more competitive, where a lot of these independent teams can approach different publishers and usually keep the IP in the agreement. And that's why Sony has been a lot more lax on that, even to the point where things like Stellar Blade, they don't own the IP. They published it. They published Rise of the Ronin. They published Neo. And sometimes these games don't leave PS5, but in most cases they do, right? They used to just always lock those games down and own them entirely, but that's not really what the business is nowadays. So it could simply be a different kind of publishing agreement that goes back to those days, or maybe there is something more there. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But Giant Squid, I could see how it happens. It would be surprising, though. Definitely, for sure, I would not think that one was something Sony would do. Moving on to some news for some older games. I love stories like this, which is Mod Nation Racers on PlayStation 3 has been brought back online by a private community. And it's very similar to how these games usually come back. It's simply changing DNS settings, and you can get into their private server where they've got most things working, the creation station, full online play and matchmaking. It's incredible work. I always love when a community gets together and they can bring these games back on and they're functional and they feel just like they did when they came out back in the day. And it's always that much better when it's simply changing DNS settings. Sometimes more complex games need a capture of a final build of the game, and then you have to use custom firmware at the very least, or HEN, but usually when you have to install packages, that makes the hurdle, the barrier so much higher. In this case, you own the game, insert it into a PS3, and it is good to go. I guess they've also got RPCS3 working as well, so lovely stuff. I'm sure you will see that show up in PS3 Online in 2026. Now, another really cool thing that happened in the preservation landscape is the discovery of a long-lost, nearly 20-year Ratchet & Clank game that was basically done and never came out. Which, for those that don't know, there was a Ratchet & Clank mobile game in 2005 called Going Mobile, and I mean Java flip phone games. So that one is basically like a side-scrolling GBA-looking Ratchet & Clank, and it's always cool when people find out about that game because it was indeed a very real thing. But that game was supposed to have a sequel the next year in 2006, but it never came out. So it's been lost to time for like 20-something years, until very, very recently, where the game was discovered again by the Ratchet & Clank community. So there was a surviving copy. It was encrypted, or decrypted rather, and now there is a full build dumped and preserved online that is super cool. Love seeing stuff like this. I guess the game did come out at some point very briefly and then taken down. Don't know what the deal is there. I know the Golden Bolt did a video on it. I didn't have a chance to spend time watching the whole thing, but he's got the full scoop on it, so you could probably go check out that upload. But man, I love seeing stuff like this, and it's so dope that the game is now back and it's fully playable under emulation. Now we have more classic PlayStation news, which is some stories and accounts from PlayStation leadership themselves, or former leadership, because we had this conversation from Christopher Dring of thegamesbusiness.com, where he got to speak with OG PlayStation veterans Chris Deering, Jim Ryan, of course, Martin Altimes, Juan Montez, and Jeff Glendinning. And so we learned a lot about how PlayStation was being rolled out in Europe, which many of these stories we've heard previously over the years, or at least I certainly have, like how they put PS1s in nightclubs and the advertising was very adult oriented in Europe. Psygnosis and the original Wipeout played a big role there. For those that don't know, they even launched Wipeout 64, which they did talk about for a little bit, and they admitted that the studio had a lot of autonomy, so that's how that happened, basically, where they released an N64 game alongside some PlayStation ones for that PlayStation IP. But they were very localized in how they distributed the PS1 there for Europe. So they did admit that it was supposed to launch on September 9th, like in the US, but it was really slow there with the console and game. So instead, the PS1 came out on the 29th instead. And we also heard that the CEO, Ken Kutaragi, was apparently very frustrated with how that market was very inefficient, or he felt it was very inefficient. But the new things that we did learn. So this was, as far as we know, the first time we've heard this from PlayStation before, but they were very close to acquiring the simulator developer Bullfrog, which was Peter Molyneux's company. So it was EA that made a counter offer at the time, and they picked up the studio instead. And another really cool revelation was that PlayStation was in talks to secure the FIFA license. Now, apparently they were very, very close to getting it, but they decided not to pursue it in order to have a good working relationship with, quote, a third party. I'm sure we all know who that is, but it's crazy to hear that they could have had one, Peter Molyneux's company, because the first one that they brought in was Psygnosis, and PlayStation at that point did a lot of publishing agreements on a per title basis. It wasn't until a few years later that they started picking up more studios, but they would have had Peter Molyneux's team of all things, which would have been insane. And that was right when he launched Theme Park, and that game blew up and was highly successful. But there was that, and securing FIFA would have been insane because that agreement was a very long-term thing. It would have secured PlayStation as, well, it already kind of is in a way in the console space, but it would have really exacerbated that that sort of lead PlayStation had in Europe, because that is the thing about PlayStation and its history in Europe, is that it's really the Nintendo and Sony world. People tend to forget that Xbox really only did well in North America, and PlayStation has always had a pretty substantial lead there, but having strictly FIFA not on Xbox would have been kind of insane if they were to hold the license in that kind of regard for the time that they would have had it. Moving on to some absolutely insane news going on in the Xbox hardware and services landscape, which we would be remiss to not mention these things and what it could or could not mean for PlayStation. So I'm sure a lot of you saw the headlines. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on. So we'll try and summarize this as best as we can and give you the most context. So first up, we had Sneakers SO on NeoGAF. They were the ones who originally in late 2023 called out Microsoft's entire multi-platform shift, just to give you that context on their legitimacy. So they posted a new, very lengthy message painting a fairly grim picture of Xbox hardware. So to summarize that, they said there's more Xbox layoffs early next year. More retailers are going to drop Xbox Series X and S. There's more price increases for Game Pass and cloud. Xbox will continue focusing on software publishing, and next-gen hardware for 2026 is now, quote, up in the air, which The Verge's Tom Warren doesn't necessarily corroborate these, but they do say Sneakers SO does know a lot about what's going on internally at Microsoft, which all of this led the company to release a statement to Windows Central saying, quote, "We are actively investing in our future first-party consoles and devices designed, engineered, and built by Xbox. For more details, the community can revisit our agreement announcement with AMD." Now, alongside all of this, there was a report from Bloomberg that Microsoft lost $300 million in sales by putting Call of Duty on Game Pass last year, and that expense was allegedly calculated on the expected lost sales on Xbox and PC, where the service was available. And then we also had the former FTC chairman, Lina Khan, write on Twitter that the Activision Blizzard acquisition led to exactly what she called out: price hikes and layoffs. So there's just been, headline after headline about just very grim news relating to Xbox. They cannot catch any sort of, PR reprieve here, because it's just been bad news after bad news after bad news about their current position. Hardware being up in the air was the big one, which the thing is, based on AMD contracts alone, Could they get out of that? Sure. I would imagine there's always a way to get out of those agreements, just with a heavy penalization and whatever they would have to pay to get out of the agreements and not, lock in an SoC they've been building for years now at this point. So I would safely still think that, yes, we are getting Xbox hardware, which now we're getting some rumors and accounts from people at AMD that very much is on the way. And I think that was all but certain anyway. So not to sort of say Sneakers SO is lying here, but there could always be a handful of discussions behind the scenes and the hardware comes out anyway. But as far as something after that is obviously a big thing that's up for debate. But without even getting too much into the weeds of the obvious Xbox news that's going on, as far as PlayStation goes, and that's been the conversation on the PlayStation side of things, is that Sony would go uncontested in the high-end console space. This is what I keep saying, and we really got to drive this point home. PlayStation would they be uncontested? Sure. Would that mean they have a certain level of confidence, maybe in certain respects to how they operate their business? Sure, that is also a distinct possibility, and I don't want that to be a future either. And I've always said about Xbox in the last 10 years of this console, or the brand really struggling, is that I do not want them to go away. I sincerely do enjoy Xbox. I enjoy first-party development in those games, and I enjoy traditional console exclusivity when they're built by internal studios. And, I always liked the mix of the fandom. I don't enjoy the ugly side of it, but I've always enjoyed the console model in the very traditional sense for the last 30, 40-something years, right? But the issue is, with Xbox, if they were to go away, PlayStation still has a duty on their own to sell a compelling low-price console in this environment where screen time is incredibly valuable. They are not simply competing with Xbox or even Nintendo Switch 2, which oftentimes can be skewed off as its own thing and it's more of a complementary device. But at the end of the day, if somebody's spending their time off of PlayStation, that is what motivates them to keep the prices low as they can reasonably get away with, build fantastic games, good software, a compelling console with a great UI. They always have a duty here, and they're hyper concerned with this new generation coming in, spending their screen time on TikTok, Instagram, or buying gaming PCs, right? Like they still have an issue here, so I think it's a little more nuanced when we say that if Xbox goes away, PlayStation can do whatever they want. Not necessarily. Maybe in certain respects, yes, and I don't want that path. But, if they want to sell consoles and sell consoles to a younger audience, they still have work to do. Arguably, they have that work to do right now with PlayStation 5. So that's always the thing I like to bring up in these conversations. Now that is a good segue into our next story, which is some eye-opening sales data for video game buyers in the US, where this was from Matt Piscatella of Circana, which does track video game sales data here in the US. And so Matt put out this chart showing off the buying habits for consumers in this country. And it shows that about 33% of players, so a third of people, don't even buy a game per year on average. 12% is once a year, and then 18% is 2 per year. The very end, though, only 4% of players buy more often than once a month. Those are your very hardcore, dedicated consumers that are often buying games a la carte. 4% of the pie, which arguably, if you're watching this video, you're probably in that pie or right outside of it. It's a very small subset of consumers that are a lot more engaged in buying games on a regular basis. And that's always the thing. That's why PlayStation and every other publisher is highly motivated to build a free-to-play title that can fall into that 33% category and capture the money and screen time there. So the model is just, it's a lot different. I mean, my generation and many of you, I have YouTube analytics that tells me, most of you are probably in the same age range as me, but we all come from that generation of you buy a game, you're done, you move on. You go rent a game, but that was the thing. Like you finish something, you move on. We did not have forever games unless you were really young and you only had one game that you had to wait until Christmas came up or something, or a birthday, holiday. You got a lot of time in on that one single player title until the next one came out. But the buying habits are much different nowadays for the casual audience. But to bear in mind, the casual audience was always lower volume in the sense that they don't buy nearly as many games as highly engaged customers. Let's move on to some third-party news here, starting off with Square Enix and Final Fantasy VII Remake Integrate and also Rebirth, where there is now a very expected double pack available for pre-order on Square's site. It comes out December 4th for $60 USD, and it does have both games across 3 Blu-ray discs. I don't think it's clear right now if it's a proper reprint of these games, so they would have the latest patches on disc and also the content and the Yuffie DLC on the disc, but for now they are offering that. I'm not sure how often this would appeal to people, when I know for some it's like if you haven't started the remake series just yet, you're probably waiting for the third entry at this point. I've got a buddy that absolutely loves Final Fantasy VII. He has not played these games because he's like, I'll just wait for all of them to come out and I'll buy the very expected triple pack because, you know, Square is going to be monetizing every variation of this game when it does come out. So if you want the double pack for just the variant, it's available. It is still a good way to jump in, but for the most part, you can probably also wait for a third pack as well. Moving on to Expedition 33, where Sandfall Interactive has confirmed 5 million copies sold since the game came out 5 months ago. So big congrats to Sandfall because they obviously landed on something very special here. And to celebrate that announcement, they're also confirming new content as well. So they did say there's going to be some new playable locations with new enemy encounters, new bosses for the late game players, new costumes, and new text and UI localizations coming as well. So the game will be playable in more formats. And that is great to see. I'm so happy to see a team like this land on something very special and not rest on those laurels where they're still expanding and improving the game as well for people that are really enjoying it right now. We have a small update on Red Dead Redemption 2's PS5 native version. So recently over on Twitter, we had somebody reach out to Nate the Hate and ask if the Switch 2 versions and also the current gen versions are still on the way. And Nate said, yes, they exist, just no idea on timing. You would imagine they are probably not too far away. We've got more and more hints that these games are ready to be revealed relatively soon, and you would think that will happen at some point, but given it's Rockstar's games, they might not want to step on their own toes of GTA 6, so I'd be curious if it's going to be announced and shipped before this year actually does close out, because you'd probably want to do that before Q1, Q2, going into 2026, where you're going to have that breathing room for GTA 6. Moving on to Remedy and Control, they've recently patched the game to version 1.30, where this includes not only the pre-order costumes for the game, so if you didn't have those, now you can get them by updating the game, but also PS5 Pro support as well, and they are doing it right. So not only can you unlock the frame rate on PS5 Pro, you can do it on the base console, and there's proper VRR and 120Hz support as well, but on PS5 Pro, you can turn off PSSR or turn it on manually. So definitely some granular controls on this game, which is what PS5 Pro in particular does need, especially for PSSR. We will find out shortly with some analysis if PSSR is problematic for the game in some way or in some instances, but at least you will have that option to turn it on or off at your leisure and still enjoy Pro enhancements. So that is excellent to see Remedy do it like that. And also, it's a great game. I love that they're still updating this game too. It's a really great science fiction, third-person action game. If you're into the SCP Foundation, like it's inspired by that. So it's always a really cool game. So I recommend that one if you have not played it just yet. Moving on to a little PSA for Call of Duty Black Ops 6, last year's entry, where right now Activision is allowing people to play the game for free. Like straight up, there's a trial going on until October 16th, and it is everything. The full campaign, zombies, and multiplayer, you can just play the game for free, which is definitely the kind of PSA that I think is worth putting out there, especially right before Black Ops 7 does come out. The single-player campaign is only like 6-ish something hours. They're always relatively short, so definitely jump into that game and at least play the campaign if you're interested. But they are looking to get interest in that game right before Black Ops 7 does come out. And also the recent competitor with Battlefield coming out today. So if you're playing that game today, I hope you thoroughly enjoy it. But the news for Battlefield is that there were some early copies of the game that got out, and we actually saw that the game is completely on disc, which is rare for this kind of game. So not only is the single-player campaign on there, but the multiplayer build is fully on there as well. There's, of course, patches, but it was cool to see that the game was completely installable offline. So it's great, but also weird in the sense that the game does require a persistent online connection. So that's lame, but at the very minimum, you don't really see that usually with games like this. Now, in other physical game news, we can also mention Oblivion Remastered, which was announced to get a physical print launching very soon. This is the Remastered Deluxe Edition. And yet again, Microsoft has dropped the ball. It's installable and launchable offline only to a certain point, then it requires a download. So, pretty misleading. You still need online. It's a single-player game, and it is big. I know it's like 120-something gigs, so in theory, you were never going to get this game on 2 discs, because I sincerely doubt they would take that extra mile for the physical print of the game. But, you know, sometimes you hope, at the very least, put as much data as you can on the disc, and they just couldn't be bothered to do that, which Gears was fine. You know, so sometimes they do it right, sometimes they don't. And this is a game that shipped well after the digital launch, so you would think we would get better, but still not the case. Now, with all that said, it is time for Let's Talk Plus, the weekly Let's Talk PlayStation giveaway, where one of you can win a $10 PSN code. I would like to congratulate this viewer right here. I'll be contacting you very soon via email or X. And if you'd like to win a $10 PSN code, it is so simple. You can follow the link down below or scan the QR code, enter the Gleam giveaway, and supporting this channel a number of ways can gain you an entry, and I'll announce the winner next week, because I'm trying to help pay for your games. Those are all the stories from this past week that I wanted to talk about with you all, and our Tuesday video was more PS1 and PS2 memory cards. I recently won this listing on eBay. It was like $20-something after taxes and shipping for 20 untested PS1 and PS2 cards, and as per usual, we load them up, check out those very nostalgic save files, and also load up some files as well, so go check that out. We also have a proper extended version for Patreon and YouTube channel members, so that's available now as well. And then we also had Click R3 episode 33 streamed last night, so that should be archived on the Spawncast Network channel. And that's pretty much it for housekeeping. Should be an upload on Tuesday as per usual, but that is pretty much it. So that concludes this week's episode of Let's Talk PlayStation. I'm Ryan Panecki. Thank you all so much for talking with me, and I will see you all next Friday.